Lydia Carter hadn't cried in 3 years. Not when her father left. Not when the bank took the house. Not when she crawled into a hole in the ground and told herself it was enough. But the morning Caleb Morgan walked into Henderson's mercantile, held up a single loaf of bread with both hands, and demanded to know who made it, something cracked open inside her chest before she even knew his name. She just didn't know yet that a stranger's question was about to cost her everything she'd built to keep herself safe. If this story already has you feeling something, subscribe to this channel, follow every part until the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The bread appeared on Henderson's counter on a Tuesday morning, same as it had every Tuesday for the past 14 months. No note, no name. Just a single loaf wrapped in plain cloth, left before sunrise while the town was still sleeping. Bill Henderson had stopped asking questions after the 3rd week. He sold it, kept a fair cut, and left an envelope of coins on the back step of the mercantile every Friday. The envelope always disappeared by Saturday morning. That was the arrangement. Nobody saw who made it. Nobody needed to. Until Caleb Morgan rode in from the Double M. He came in for nails. Standard order, 2 pounds iron heavy gauge, the kind used for fence repair. He set his hat on the counter, gave Henderson the usual nod, and was 3 seconds from turning around and leaving when his eye caught the loaf sitting at the edge of the display shelf. He stopped. Something about it didn't fit. Not the shape, it was plain enough. Not the size. It was the color, the way the crust had browned evenly, all the way around, the kind of even bake you didn't get from a wood stove with a broken door or a fire running too hot on one side. Somebody had paid attention. Somebody had stood over that bread and cared whether it came out right. In a town where most things were done halfway, that was unusual enough to notice. He picked it up. How much? Henderson glanced over. 40 cents. Caleb turned it in his hands once, set it back down, then picked it up again. Who made it? Henderson paused the way a man does when he's deciding whether an answer is his to give. Don't rightly know her full situation, he said carefully. Woman named Carter, lives outside town. Caleb looked up. Carter. Frank Carter's people. His daughter, Lydia. Something shifted behind Caleb's eyes, but he kept his face still. Frank Carter died 2 winters back. Yes, sir. And she's still out there. Henderson wiped the counter with a rag that wasn't doing much good. Far as I know. Caleb set the bread down once more, stared at it for a moment, like it had said something to him. She living in that dugout? The silence that followed was answer enough. Caleb paid for the bread and the nails, tucked the loaf under his arm, and walked out without another word. The other men in the mercantile exchanged looks. Nobody said anything. Lydia had been awake since 4. Not because she needed to be exactly, but because sleep had never come easily to her, not since the first winter alone, and she'd long since stopped fighting it. She rose when the dark was still thick, built the fire small and steady, the way her mother had taught her, and started the dough before the sky showed any color at all. The dugout was 12 feet wide and 9 feet deep. She knew every inch of it the way you know something you've had no choice but to learn. The ceiling was low enough that a tall man would have to duck. The walls were packed earth-cool in summer and merely cold in winter, which was something at least. She'd lined 2 of them with boards salvaged from what remained of the old house, hung a strip of canvas over the entryway to keep the worst of the wind out. It wasn't much. She had stopped needing it to be more. She shaped the dough by feel more than sight, her hands working in the dim firelight with the kind of practiced ease that doesn't require thought. 2 loaves, same as always. 1 for Henderson's, 1 for herself to last the week. She didn't think about the town while she worked. She had learned not to. The town had made its position clear the winter after her father died, when she'd gone to Reverend Aldous, asking whether the church might have work for her, anything at all, cleaning or mending, or helping with the children's school. Aldous had looked at her the way people look at a problem they'd rather not deal with, and told her gently that the congregation was doing all it could for its members, and that he was sorry for her circumstances, and that perhaps she might consider moving on to somewhere with more opportunity. She'd understood what he meant. She was not considered a member. She was Frank Carter's leftover daughter, living in a hole in the ground on the edge of town, and the kindest thing anyone had figured out to do with her was pretend she wasn't there. She had obliged them. The first time she heard hoofbeats coming down her path, the faint double track through the grass that she had worn herself over 14 months of walking. She didn't go to the door. She stood very still at the work table with her back to the entryway and listened. Most people who came out this way were lost. They'd realize it soon enough and turn around. She'd learned to wait them out, but the hoofbeats stopped. And then boots hit the ground. And then there was a knock. Not on the canvas, there was nothing to knock on, but on the wooden post she'd set at the left side of the entry, a solid, deliberate knock, like a man accustomed to being answered. She turned around. A man was standing at the edge of the light, one hand still raised. Tall, dark hat, wide shoulders and a worn brown vest. He wasn't looking around at the walls or the low ceiling the way people did when they were cataloging how small it was. He was looking directly at her. "Miss Carter." She kept her hands flat on the table. "Who's asking?" "Caleb Morgan." He didn't add anything to it, just the name offered plain. She knew the name. Everyone in 30 miles knew the name. The Double M was the largest ranch in the county, had been for 20 years, first under his father and now under him. She had never had occasion to speak to him before. "What do you need?" she asked. He reached under his arm and held out the cloth-wrapped loaf. "I bought this from Henderson this morning." She waited. "You made it," he said. It wasn't a question. "I did." He was quiet for a moment, studying her the way she imagined he studied things he was trying to figure out. Not rude, not unkind, just thorough. "It's good bread," he said. Something pulled tight in her throat that she refused to let go anywhere. "Thank you. I don't say that to a lot of people." "I didn't ask you to." He almost smiled. She saw the corner of his mouth shift just slightly before he caught it. "No," he said. "You didn't." He set the loaf down on the nearest flat surface, which happened to be an overturned crate near the door. "Henderson says you've been supplying him for over a year." 14 months. "He pay you fair?" The question surprised her enough that she answered it honestly. "Fair enough." Caleb nodded slowly. Looked around the dugout once, not cataloging, she realized now, but assessing. There was a difference. "Your roof's got a soft spot on the east corner," he said. She blinked. "I know. Gonna go before fall if it doesn't get braced." "I know that too." He looked back at her. "You got the material for it?" She stared at him. "Mr. Morgan, I don't know what you want, but I manage fine." "I didn't say you didn't." "Then why are you here?" He picked up his hat from where he'd set it, turned the brim once through his fingers. "Honestly," he said, "I don't entirely know. I bought a loaf of bread, and I wanted to see who made it." He looked at her steadily. "Now I have. I'll leave you be." He turned to go. She didn't call after him, but she stood at the edge of the canvas and watched him mount and ride back down the path, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt noticed. She hated it. She hated it because she knew better. She'd been noticed before, and it had never meant what she'd wanted it to mean. Her father's friends had noticed her after Frank died, noticed her the way men notice something unguarded and unprotected, and she'd had to become very clear, very fast about what she would and would not accept. The church ladies had noticed her once brought out a basket of goods. The first Christmas, smiled at her with such careful pity that she'd had to work hard to thank them without her voice shaking from the anger of it. Being noticed, she had learned, was not the same as being seen. She went back inside. She didn't think about Caleb Morgan for the rest of the day. She told herself that, and mostly believed it. He came back Thursday. She was outside when he arrived this time, splitting the week's wood with the hatchet she kept sharp, because a dull blade was more dangerous than a sharp one, and she couldn't afford to lose a hand. She heard the hoofbeats, early heard them slow to a walk on the path, and kept splitting. He rode up and stopped and watched her work for a moment. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She set the next piece of wood on the block. "You need help with that." She swung the hatchet. The wood split clean. "No." He dismounted anyway. She set another piece on the block. "I said I didn't need help." "You said you didn't need help." He crouched down and started stacking what she'd already split neat and tight against the wall of the dugout, the way wood should be stacked to keep it dry. "I didn't offer to help, I'm just stacking." She stopped, looked at him. He looked back at her perfectly level. "Keep going," he said. "You're doing fine." Something about the matter-of-fact way he said it. Not "you're doing well for a woman," not "I'm impressed." Just "you're doing fine," the same thing he might say to a hand back at the ranch. Loosened something in her that she immediately tried to tighten back up. She kept splitting. He kept stacking. For a while, neither of them said anything. Then Caleb said, without looking up from what he was doing, "You been out here since your father passed?" "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." He nodded like that confirmed something. "You got family anywhere else?" "No." "Friends in town?" She almost laughed. "Not exactly." He glanced at her then. Not with pity. She would have been able to end the conversation in about 4 seconds if it had been pity. It was something more like attention, like he was filing the information somewhere and would think about it later. "Aldous say something to you?" he asked. She hesitated. "I know how he operates," Caleb said. "Just asking." "He was polite about it," she said carefully. "Being polite about a cruel thing doesn't make it less cruel." She set the hatchet head on the block and leaned on the handle. "Why do you care, Mr. Morgan?" He stood up and brushed bark off his hands. "Caleb," he said. "Why do you care, Caleb?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "My mother died when I was 11, he said finally. "My father kept the ranch running with her gone and 3 boys too young to be of much use. Closest neighbor was 8 miles. Nobody checked on him for 4 months one winter." He picked up the hatchet and turned it once in his hand, inspecting the blade, then set it carefully back where she'd had it. "Found out later the town knew he was struggling. Just figured it wasn't their business." Lydia said nothing. "I don't like it," he said simply, "when people decide someone else's survival isn't their business." He picked up his hat from the fence post. "I'll be by Saturday. I've got some cedar planking on the ranch that isn't being used. I want to brace that east corner before it fails." She opened her mouth. He looked at her. She closed it. "I can pay for the planking," she said instead. "You already did," he said. That bread was worth considerably more than 40 cents. He rode away before she could argue. Saturday came. He brought the planking. He brought a younger hand to help carry it, a boy of about 17 named Dell, who said, "Yes, ma'am," every time Lydia looked at him and handled the wood with careful, earnest effort. Caleb said very little. He worked the way he did everything Lydia was beginning to notice efficiently, without waste, without looking around to see if anyone was watching. He braced the east corner and reinforced 2 sections of the roof framing she hadn't realized were weakening. And when he was done, he walked the perimeter of the dugout once with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the ground and the sky, alternately reading the drainage, the way a man reads it, who spent his life thinking about water and land. "You're going to get water through the north wall if we get a heavy rain," he said. "I know. I've got rags." He looked at her. "Rags," he repeated. "They work well enough. I'll bring gravel next time. Pack it along the base. That'll hold better than rags." "You don't have to. Lydia." He said her name without ceremony, without announcement, just the name, direct and plain. She stopped. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'm going to." Dell was pretending very hard to be interested in something in the far corner of the dugout. Lydia looked at Caleb for a long moment. She had spent 14 months building a life that required nothing from anyone. She had gotten good at it. She had made a virtue of needing nothing, had told herself that self-sufficiency was dignity, and that waiting for help was for people who hadn't learned better yet. But standing here with this man who had come back twice, had fixed her roof without being asked, had stacked her wood without making a production of it, who said her name like it was simply her name and not an apology or a condescension. She found she didn't have the argument she thought she had. "Next time you come," she said finally, "I'll have bread." Something in his face settled like a question that had been waiting a while had just been answered. "I'll be here," he said. Outside, the summer wind moved across the prairie in long, slow waves, bending the grass flat and letting it rise again the same as it always did. But Lydia stood at the doorway of the dugout and watched the dust of his horse settle on the path, and she felt for the first time in a very long time that the ground beneath her feet was something other than all there was. She didn't know yet what it meant, but she stopped for one single moment before going back inside, and she let herself stand in the sunlight. He came back the following Tuesday. Not Friday, the way she'd half expected, half prepared herself for, half dreaded, but Tuesday early before she'd even gotten the second loaf shaped. She heard the hoofbeats on the path, and her hands stilled in the dough for exactly 3 seconds before she made herself keep moving. She would not be the kind of woman who stopped working because a man rode up. He knocked on the post the same way he had the first time, deliberate, patient. "Doors open," she called out, which was a ridiculous thing to say since there was no door, only the canvas, but he seemed to understand what she meant, because he pushed it aside and stepped in, ducking his head under the frame, with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it before. He hadn't. He'd only been here twice. But he moved like he had. "You're early," she said without looking up. "I know." He set something down on the crate near the door. She heard the thud of it heavier than bread, and came to stand at the edge of her work table. Not close enough to crowd her. Just present. "What's that?" she asked, nodding toward the crate. "Gravel, for the north wall base." He looked at the loaves taking shape under her hands. "I said I'd bring it." "You said next time. That was Saturday. It's Tuesday." "Tuesday is next time." She looked up at him then. He was watching her work with that same level, unhurried attention he gave everything, and she found, as she had found on Saturday and on Thursday and on the first day he'd appeared in her doorway with her own bread in his hands, that it was difficult to be irritated at a man who simply said what he meant. "There's coffee," she said, "if you want it." "I'd like that." She nodded toward the pot on the fire. "Help yourself. Cups are on the shelf." He did without fuss. Poured himself a cup, looked at the shelf long enough to find the second cup, poured that one too, and set it near her elbow on the work table. She didn't say anything. But something shifted very slightly in the tight, careful arrangement she kept around herself. They stayed like that for a while, her working the dough, him standing with his coffee, the fire doing its quiet work in the corner. It wasn't a comfortable silence exactly. It was the silence of two people who haven't decided yet what they are to each other, and are both paying close enough attention to know it. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Yes." "Why Tuesday?" He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't give her a fast answer. "I had a fence crew out yesterday on the south pasture," he said. "Came back late. Was thinking about that north wall." "You were thinking about my north wall." "I was." She pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. "Most men don't think about things that aren't theirs." "Most men don't notice bread that's been baked with that kind of care either," he said. "I tend to notice things." She kept working. "What else do you notice?" He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have a chair that doesn't wobble," he said. "The hinge on that shelf is bending. You're rationing the flour more than you need to if Henderson's been paying you every week. And you haven't slept a full night in a while, if I had to guess." She stopped. She looked at him. He held her gaze without apology. "Why would you guess that?" she said. "Because you're moving efficient," he said. "Not rested efficient. Survival efficient. There's a difference." For a moment she didn't say anything. The fire popped once. The wind moved against the canvas. "You notice too much," she said. "Probably," he agreed. She went back to the bread. He drank his coffee. And Lydia Carter held very still on the inside because what Caleb Morgan had just done without drama, without a single kind word that could be called pity, was see her more accurately in 3 visits than most people had managed in 24 years. And she did not know what to do with that. She did not know at all. He packed the gravel along the north wall himself, working steadily, while she shaped the loaves and slid them into the oven. He asked her twice where she wanted the grade to run, and then did it exactly that way without suggesting she might want it differently. When he finished, he came back inside and washed his hands in the basin she kept near the door and accepted the refilled coffee she handed him without remarking on the fact that she'd poured it without asking. "Tell me about your father," he said. She'd been expecting him not to ask that. She'd been braced for the easier questions. "How long have you been here? Do you have any money saved? What do you need?" The question about her father caught her somewhere below the sternum. "Why?" she asked. "Because you've been out here alone for 14 months and nobody from town comes down this path," he said, "and I want to understand why." Lydia leaned against the work table, crossed her arms, looked at the fire for a moment. "My father was not a popular man," she said. "I know, he owed money to half the county. He owed money to everybody. He borrowed against the house, against the land, against things he didn't own yet and never managed to own." She paused. "He wasn't dishonest. He was just—" She stopped again, searching. "He always believed the next thing was going to be the thing that fixed it. The next season, the next crop, the next deal. He died still believing it. And left you with the debts. And left me with the debts, and a house that the bank took in 30 days. She said it plainly, the way you say a thing you've already grieved all the way through. I had $8 and a flour sack. The dugout was already on the land. Frank had dug it when he first came out here before he built the house. I figured it would do until I worked something out. 14 months is a long time to keep working something out. It's also a long time to get clear on what you can do without." He looked at her steadily. "What do you think you can do without—" She met his eyes. "I'm still making the list." Something moved across his face, then not a smile exactly, more like a recognition. Like she'd said something he'd been turning over himself for years and hadn't found the right words for. "The town should have helped you," he said. "The town thought my father's failures were contagious. That's not—" He stopped himself, started again. "That's not how it should work." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He set down his cup. He looked at her with that direct, measuring look that she was starting to recognize, the look he gave a problem he'd decided he was going to solve, whether or not the problem had asked to be solved. "I'm going to fix that chair," he said. "Caleb. The wobbly one. I've got a leg in my saddlebag that'll fit it." She stared at him. "You brought a chair leg." "I noticed the chair on Saturday. You brought a chair leg on the chance that you'd—" "I measured it by eye. Might need some adjustment." He picked up his hat. "Chair legs aren't complicated." She watched him go back outside to his horse, pull a length of turned wood from the saddlebag, and come back in like this was the most ordinary Tuesday in the world. She stood in the middle of her own home and felt something dangerously close to laughter building in her chest. She did not let it out. But it was there. "Matam." He fixed the chair. It took him 20 minutes and a small folding knife and some sandpaper he'd also apparently thought to bring, and when he set it back on the floor and pressed down on the seat to test it, the thing was as solid as the day it had been made, probably more so. "Sit in it," he said. "I know it works." "Sit in it anyway." She sat in the chair. It didn't wobble. She looked up at him. "Satisfactory?" he asked. "It's a chair," she said. "Yes." He allowed himself a small smile that time. She saw it fully. The way it changed the lines at the corners of his eyes made him look for just a moment less like a man solving a problem and more like a man who was quietly somewhere he wanted to be. She looked away before he noticed her noticing. Outside, far down the road toward town, she heard wagon wheels and voices of family passing, probably headed toward Henderson's. Nothing unusual. But the voices got louder for a moment, and she heard a woman say something sharp and a man laugh, and then they were past, and the sound faded, and the path was quiet again. Caleb had gone still. "What?" she asked. Do you know whose wagon that was? The Alderton family, probably. They come through on Tuesdays. He nodded slowly, said nothing for a moment. Then, they ever stop? She looked at him. Why would they? He looked back at her. And the question she hadn't asked hung in the air between them, the real one, the one under his question, because they both knew the answer. The Aldertons didn't stop because stopping would mean acknowledging she was there, and acknowledging she was there would mean making some kind of decision about what they were going to do about her, and it was simpler and easier and kinder to themselves to simply not stop. No, she said quietly. They don't stop. He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through something, not anger, not exactly. Something more controlled than anger, the kind of feeling a man carries for a long time before he does something about it. You've been feeding this town, he said. I've been selling bread to a mercantile. That bread goes to their tables. They eat it. And not one of them has... He stopped. Caleb. She kept her voice steady. I've made my peace with it. You shouldn't have to. No, she said. I shouldn't have. But I have, and that's different. She looked at him directly. Don't be angry on my behalf. It doesn't help me. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once the way a man nods when he's accepting a point he disagrees with because he respects the person making it. All right, he said. Thank you. He picked up his hat. I've got work this afternoon. I'll be back Saturday. You don't have to keep Saturday, he said. Not unkindly, just certain. She walked him to the door, the canvas, the post, the open air. He mounted his horse, settled in the saddle, looked back at her once. The bread, he said. The loaf you left at Henderson's the first day I came in. What about it? I ate half of it on the ride home. He paused. Other half the next morning. Both times I thought whoever made this was paying attention to what they were doing. Not just going through motions. Lydia said nothing. That matters, he said. Paying attention matters, more than most people think. He turned his horse and rode away down the path. She stood there until she couldn't hear the hoofbeats anymore. Then she went back inside, sat down in the chair that no longer wobbled, and put her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. Paying attention matters. She had been paying attention for 14 months. To the flower, to the fire, to the slow progress of saving enough to matter, to the careful maintenance of a life that depended entirely on her own continuity. Nobody had ever suggested that it mattered. She didn't cry. She came close. But she didn't. He was back Saturday as promised. He brought the gravel he'd already brought and something else, a length of oilcloth, dark brown, heavy enough to block wind better than canvas. For the entryway, he said. She looked at it, looked at him. You're going to tell me you don't need it, he said. I was going to ask how much. It's spare material from the bunkhouse. Caleb. Lydia. They looked at each other. I'm keeping count, she said. Everything you bring I'm keeping count. I know you are. I will pay you back. I know that too. I'm not a charity case. I know. He held out the oilcloth. It's a door. She took it. He hung it himself, rigged it on the iron rod she already had above the entry, so it rolled up and stayed out of the way in good weather, dropped down fast in wind or rain. When he tested it, she had to admit, standing there with her arms crossed and her face arranged in careful neutrality, that it was considerably better than what she'd had. It's good, she said. It'll hold. Dell wasn't with him today. It was just the two of them, and the dugout felt different because of it, the same size it had always been, but with a kind of specific contained quality, like something that had been decided about this space without being said. She'd made extra bread that morning. She wasn't going to mention that. He noticed it anyway. You made 2 loaves, he said, looking at the shelf. I did. That's more than you usually keep for yourself. She looked at him. You've been counting my loaves. You had 1 loaf on the shelf last Saturday. This week you have 2. Maybe I was hungry. Were you? She turned to the fire. Would you like some lunch, Caleb? A pause. Yes, he said. I would. She cut the bread. She had a hard cheese she'd been rationing and some dried beef she'd traded 2 loaves for last month with a passing cattle hand, and she put it all together on the plank she used as a serving board and set it on the table between them, and they ate. It was the first meal she'd shared with another person in over a year. She didn't say that. She didn't have to. He ate the bread with the full, honest attention he gave. Everything tasted it, not just consumed it. Tasted it like it was worth tasting. And halfway through, he set down the bread and looked at her with something she hadn't seen directed at her in a very long time. Genuine appreciation. Not the careful, pitying appreciation of people who wanted to acknowledge her situation without engaging with it. Not the obligatory appreciation of someone who'd asked how she was doing and didn't want a real answer. Just recognition. Clear and uncomplicated, the way you recognize something that's genuinely good. You know, this is remarkable, he said. What you can do with basic material. She shook her head slightly. I mean it, he said. Don't wave that off. It's bread, Caleb. It's craftsmanship, he said. Same thing my best fence hand does my best horse trainer. They pay attention to what they're doing. They care whether it comes out right. He paused. That's not ordinary. Most people don't care that much. She looked at the table. Nobody's ever called my bread craftsmanship before, she said. Nobody was paying attention. The words landed the same way they had on Tuesday. Clean and direct and impossible to brush off because they weren't flattery. He wasn't trying to charm her, wasn't soft-pedaling. Anything wasn't building towards something she'd have to deflect. He was just telling her the truth as he saw it. She had forgotten somewhere in 14 months of managing alone that the truth could feel like this, like something you'd been cold without and hadn't let yourself name. He came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and somewhere in the middle of the 3rd week without any specific moment she could point to. Lydia stopped bracing herself when she heard hoofbeats on the path. She didn't tell herself that meant anything, but she did on Thursday morning start the fire a little earlier. The Wednesday, he didn't come. The first Wednesday she'd expected him. Without meaning to expect him. She found herself at the door of the dugout, looking down the empty path long enough that she had to consciously turn around and tell herself she was checking the weather. She was checking the weather. That was all. He rode up at dusk, which he'd never done before, and he looked tired in a different way than usual. Not physically tired, but the kind of tired that comes from something going wrong and having to manage it. Fence came down on the north boundary, he said from the saddle. Took all day. You don't have to explain yourself to me, she said. I know. He dismounted anyway, tied the horse to the fence post. I said Thursday. You were working. I said Thursday. He repeated like the work wasn't the relevant part. She looked at him for a moment. There's coffee, she said. He came inside. She poured the coffee and he sat in the chair he'd fixed. He sat in it every time now, like that was simply his chair without either of them having said so. And he put both hands around the cup and was quiet in the particular way he was quiet when he was tired. She didn't try to make conversation. She went back to what she'd been doing, mending the hem of her second dress, the only other piece of clothing she had that was still in reasonable condition. She worked by firelight, the needle moving steadily. After a while, he said without looking up, How long are you going to live out here? She kept her eyes on the mending. Until I have enough to do something different. What's enough? I'm not sure yet. What does different look like? She was quiet for a moment. It was a question she thought about sometimes in the long, early mornings, when the fire was just starting, and the dark was still everywhere. What different looked like. She had answers that she kept to herself, because they felt too large, and too exposed to say out loud the kind of answers you don't say, because saying them makes them too easy to lose. "A real kitchen," she said. "A proper stove, space enough to double the production." "You want to run a bakery?" "I want to run a business," she said. "The bread is what I know. But a bakery in a town the size of Grover could do a real trade." She paused. "If the town were willing to buy from me." "The town eats your bread now." "The town buys my bread from Henderson without knowing it's mine." He looked at her then. "You think they wouldn't buy it if they knew," he said. "I think some of them would find a reason not to." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire did its work. The new oilcloth held the wind out better than the canvas had she noticed it every night, the way the warmth stayed more reliable now, and she was aware every time she noticed it that she hadn't managed that on her own. "Let me ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." She set down the mending, looked at him directly. "What is this, Caleb? What are you doing here?" He met her eyes without hesitation. "I'm not entirely sure yet," he said. "That's not an answer." "It's the honest one." She studied him. He didn't look away, didn't shift, didn't qualify the answer with something easier. Just held her gaze and let the honesty of it stand there between them, unadorned. "I know what it's not," he said after a moment. "What is it not?" "It's not pity," he said. "I want you to know that. It has never been pity." She breathed. "Then what is it?" she asked. He turned the coffee cup once in his hands, looked into it, looked back at her. "I keep thinking about what you said," he said. "The first day I was here, I asked if you managed fine, and you said yes, and I believed you because it was true. You do manage fine." He paused. "But fine isn't the same as good, and you deserve something better than fine, Lydia. I don't know yet what I'm supposed to do about that, but I know it's not pity." The fire snapped. Outside, the night had settled in fully, and the prairie was dark and enormous and completely indifferent the way it always was. Inside this small carved space held the firelight and the coffee smell and the silence between two people standing right at the edge of something that didn't have a name yet. She picked up the mending. "You should get back to the ranch before it's too dark to ride," she said. "I know." He stood, set the cup down carefully, picked up his hat. At the door he turned back. "Saturday," he said. She kept her eyes on the mending, kept her needle moving. "Saturday," she said. She didn't look up until she was sure she'd heard his horse all the way to the end of the path. And then she sat very still in the firelight, and she let herself think just for a moment, just a careful, single moment about what it meant that she had started keeping a better count of the days. Not the days until she had enough. The days until Saturday. She folded the mending, set it aside, told herself it meant nothing. But she knew the way you know things, you are not quite ready to say that she had already started to believe him. That it was not pity. That he was telling the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was the most dangerous thing Caleb Morgan could have brought through her door. He came on Saturday in the way he always did, early, before the heat settled in, with something in his saddlebag that she hadn't asked for and wouldn't argue about anymore, because she'd learned in the 4 weeks since he'd first appeared in her doorway that arguing with Caleb Morgan about practical things was like arguing with the weather. He heard you, he considered what you said, and then he did what he'd already decided to do. This time it was a proper iron hinge for the shelf bracket he'd noticed bending on his second visit. She didn't say a word. She handed him the coffee and moved out of his way. That was new too, the moving out of his way. The first week she'd stood her ground in every square foot of the dugout like she was defending territory. Now she shifted, naturally made room the way you do with someone whose presence has stopped being a surprise. She wasn't sure when that had happened. She wasn't sure she was comfortable knowing it had. He had the hinge fitted and the screws set in 20 minutes. Tested the shelf with both hands, pressed down hard, nodded once. "That'll hold whatever you put on it," he said. "It held before. It held until it didn't." He put the screwdriver back in his vest pocket and looked at the shelf with the particular satisfaction he took in things that were now structurally sound. "There's a difference." "You say that a lot." "Because it's true, a lot." She handed him a slice of bread from the morning's bake, the good heel piece with the thickest crust, which she'd noticed he preferred without ever having been told. He took it without comment, which meant he'd noticed that she'd noticed, and neither of them said anything about it. That was new too. The whole arrangement was new. The coffee at the same time every visit. The chair that was his chair. The way the dugout had stopped feeling like a defended position and started feeling like a place where two people sometimes spent a morning talking about practical things and occasionally something more than practical. Lydia was aware of all of it. She was also aware that awareness and wisdom were not the same thing. She was working on keeping them separate. "I need to go into town Thursday," she said while he was drinking his coffee. "Henderson wants to talk about the arrangement." Caleb looked up. "What about it?" He didn't say in the note, just that he wanted to talk. "You want company?" She stopped, looked at him. "I'm capable of going to town alone," she said. "I know you are. I asked if you wanted company." She turned back to the work table. Thought about the last time she'd walked into Henderson's Mercantile 6 months ago to collect an envelope that hadn't been left on the back step. Henderson had been polite. The two women near the dry goods had gone quiet in that specific way that meant they'd been talking about something and had decided to stop. She'd taken the envelope and left in under 4 minutes. "It's a business meeting," she said. "I don't need Lydia." He said it quietly, not cutting her off, just landing her name like a hand on a shoulder. She turned around. "I'll wait outside," he said. "You go in alone, handle your business. I'll be there if you need me. And if you don't need me, I'll ride home, and we'll call it a Thursday." She looked at him for a long moment. "You have a ranch to run," she said. "I do, and it'll run for 3 hours without me." She turned back to the work table, pressed her knuckles briefly against the surface. "All right," she said, "Thursday." He didn't make anything of it, just nodded and went back to his coffee. But she felt without looking at him that there was something quiet and steady in him just then. Not triumph, not even satisfaction, just the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting for something and was now simply present in the fact of it. Thursday couldn't decide what it wanted to be yet. She told herself that didn't matter. She was wrong, and she almost knew it. They rode into Grover on Thursday morning. Caleb on his bay horse, and Lydia on the old sorrel mare she kept for the rare occasions she needed to go anywhere, and the town received them in its own particular way. Which was to say, it noticed. She felt it the moment they came down the main street. Not stares exactly. Nobody was rude enough for outright staring, but the quality of attention changed the way a room changes when something unexpected walks in. A woman hanging laundry on the near side of the dry goods looked up and kept looking. Two men outside the feed store turned their conversation inward. The boy sweeping the walk in front of the hotel went still with his broom. Caleb rode beside her like none of it was happening. She kept her back straight. Henderson was behind the counter when she came in. He was a decent man. She'd always thought so decent in the careful, limited way of someone who was trying not to make enemies. He'd treated her fairly. He hadn't gone out of his way for her. She didn't hold that against him. Going out of your way had costs in a small town. "Miss Carter," he said, "thank you for coming in. Your note said it was important." "It is. Have a seat." She sat in the chair on the customer side of the counter, the one with the worn armrest that nobody had fixed. Henderson looked at the door she'd come through, the one that faced the street where Caleb Morgan's horse was now tied to the post outside, and then he looked back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'll get straight to it," he said. "I've had a conversation with Daniel Whitmore." The name landed wrong. She kept her face still. "What does Daniel Whitmore have to do with our arrangement?" "He owns the building I lease," Henderson said. "Has for 3 years. He came in last week and told me he'd heard I was selling bread from an outside source and he wanted to know who." Lydia didn't move. "You told him?" "I told him your name, yes. I didn't think it was a secret." "It wasn't." She kept her voice level. "What did he say?" Henderson was quiet for a moment, which was its own answer. "He said he thought it might be better for the store's reputation if the baked goods came from a more established supplier." He cleared his throat. He mentioned Mrs. Albright's kitchen. She bakes on contract for the hotel. Lydia was quiet. He suggested, Henderson said more carefully now, that continuing the current arrangement might cause complications with the lease renewal in October. There it was. She had known in the back of the mind where you keep things you don't want to look at directly, that the invisibility couldn't last forever. That at some point, someone would decide to make her visible in the way that served them, rather than leaving her alone in the way that served them. She just hadn't expected it to be Daniel Whitmore, who she'd spoken to exactly once at her father's funeral, where he'd shaken her hand and said he was sorry for her loss in the voice of a man totaling a debt. "I see," she said. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter. I think your bread is—" "It's fine, Bill." She used his first name without thinking, and he looked slightly startled. "I understand your position. October is 4 months away, and a lease is a lease. I don't want to—" "I know." She stood. "Thank you for telling me directly. That was decent of you." She walked out. The sun hit her square in the face, and she kept walking to the horse untied. The lead didn't mount immediately, because she needed one moment, just one moment with her hands doing something ordinary while the thing that had just happened settled into its actual shape. Daniel Whitmore. She knew what this was. She'd seen it done before different names and different towns, but the same shape, a man with leverage deciding to use it, not because he needed to, but because he could, because someone like Lydia Carter surviving on her own was a kind of implicit statement, and some men couldn't stand implicit statements they didn't control. She put her foot in the stirrup. "Lydia." She turned. Caleb was standing 6 feet away, and she knew immediately from his face that he'd heard at least part of it. The walls of Henderson's mercantile were not particularly thick, or had read enough of her face coming out the door that he understood the shape of it. "I'm fine," she said. "I know you are." He was watching her with that steady, clear attention. "Tell me what happened." She told him. She kept it brief and factual because being brief and factual was the only way she was going to get through it without her voice doing something she didn't want it to do. Whitmore. The lease October. The polite language for get rid of her. Caleb listened without interrupting. His face didn't change much, but she'd been watching him long enough to see what moved beneath it, and what moved beneath it was not the hot, visible anger of a man who was going to say something he'd regret. It was the cold, quiet anger of a man filing information that she thought was considerably more dangerous. "Whitmore owns 4 buildings on this street," Caleb said when she finished. "I know. He also has a note on the Dalton family's farm and on the lumber yard." He paused. "He's been buying debt in this county for 5 years. She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been watching him do it." Something moved behind his eyes. "He came to me 2 years ago about the double M. Said he'd heard I was carrying some debt from the drought year and wondered if I'd like to consolidate it." He looked at her directly. "I told him no in terms he understood." She was quiet. "He backed off you because you're a Morgan." "Yes." "He's not backing off me because I'm nobody." "You're not nobody." He said it with a flatness that brooked nothing. Not argument, not qualification, not the usual deflection she'd give a compliment. Just a fact stated. She looked away down the street. The woman with the laundry had gone inside. The 2 men at the feed store were still talking, still glancing this way occasionally. "He's going to make it difficult," she said. "Probably. Henderson won't keep the arrangement if it costs him his lease." "No," Caleb agreed. "He won't. Then I lose the income." She said it the way you say something you've already survived in your head the worst shape of it looked at directly. "And I start over." "Or," Caleb said. She looked at him. "Or you don't sell through Henderson anymore. Caleb, if Whitmore is willing to pressure Henderson, he'll pressure anyone in town who tries to—" "Not anyone," he said. The morning sounds of the town moved around them, a cart, someone calling a name from somewhere down the block. The ordinary sounds of people going about their days in a place where they belonged. She looked at him for a long moment. "What are you saying?" she asked quietly. I'm saying the double M has 22 hands, he said, plus me. That's 23 people who eat breakfast every morning and would eat considerably better bread than what Cookie manages to produce. He kept his voice level, matter of fact. I'm saying I know 6 families in this valley who drive past your path every week and would stop if they knew to stop. I'm saying Daniel Whitmore has no leverage over my property, my hands, or my neighbors. She stared at him. You're talking about setting up a supply route, she said. I'm talking about you not needing Henderson's shelf anymore. She turned away, pressed her hand flat against the saddle for a moment, not mounting, just grounding herself. This was the thing about Caleb Morgan that she hadn't known how to name until this moment, the thing that was different from pity, and different from charity, and different from the careful, obligatory concern of people who wanted to feel like they'd helped without actually changing anything. He didn't offer comfort. He offered solutions. He looked at her situation the way he looked at a weak fence line or a failing roof as a problem with specific causes and specific remedies, and he addressed it with the same straightforward practicality. He gave everything without making her feel like a problem. He made her feel like a business. He made her feel like a person whose work had value that the market had simply failed to properly reach yet. She didn't know whether to thank him or be angry at him for making her feel things she'd decided she wasn't going to feel anymore. She turned back around. I'm not going to let you build me a customer base out of obligation, she said. I'm not doing it out of obligation. My hands eat terrible breakfast biscuits every morning and complain about it every afternoon. He picked up his reins. That's a practical problem with a practical solution. Caleb, come out to the ranch Saturday, he said. Talk to Cookie, see the setup, tell me if it's workable. If it isn't, we figure something else. He mounted. That's all I'm asking. She looked up at him on the horse. This man who had come down her path 6 weeks ago holding her bread in both hands, like it was something that mattered, and had come back every time since, and had fixed every broken thing he could reach, and had never once looked at her like she needed saving. Saturday, she said. Something in him settled. I'll send Dell to ride with you, he said. The East Road has a bad crossing after last week's rain. She almost told him she'd managed the East Road for 14 months. She didn't. She just rode home and thought about the shape of what was changing and tried to decide how frightened she should be. She had never been to the Double M. She'd seen it from the road, the roofline, the outbuildings, the scale of it that you could read from a distance, even if you couldn't see the details. It was a working ranch in every sense, the kind that didn't pretend otherwise, that had the marks of generations of practical use on every board and post. Dell rode beside her and talked about the horses the entire way, which she appreciated, because it meant she didn't have to talk about what she was thinking, which was that she had no idea what she was walking into and couldn't decide if that was frightening or something else. Caleb met her in the yard. He was in his working clothes, no vest sleeves rolled, the kind of ease that comes from being in a place where you belong absolutely. He helped her down with a hand she didn't strictly need and led her to the cookhouse where a man named Cookie, who was 60 if he was a day, built like a rain barrel, and had the expression of someone who had been losing an argument with his own biscuits for 20 years, looked at her like she was a solution to a problem he'd stopped hoping for. You make the bread Bill Henderson sells, Cookie said. Not a question. I do. Sit down. He pulled out a chair. Tell me about your starter. An hour later, she'd talked more about bread than she'd talked about anything in over a year, and Cookie had produced 3 of his biscuits for her evaluation, and she'd given him an honest assessment that made him wince and nod in equal measure. And Caleb had stood in the doorway of the cookhouse the whole time with his arms crossed, and the particular look of a man watching something go exactly the way he'd thought it would. She caught him looking. He didn't pretend he hadn't been. Well, he said when Cookie had gone to attend to something on the stove. Your biscuits are terrible, she said. I know. I've been eating them for 3 years. His technique is wrong at the fat stage. He's working it too long. Can you fix it? She looked at him. You mean, can I teach him? Or supply the cookhouse directly, however you want to work it. She leaned back in the chair. Cookie's chair, solid, no wobble, and thought about what it would mean. The numbers were straightforward. 23 people, daily bread. Probably biscuits, 3 mornings a week, cornbread twice. More than she currently produced. Manageable with a better setup. Profitable in a way that Henderson's arrangement, even before Whitmore, had only partially been. And free of Daniel Whitmore entirely. "I'd need to increase production," she said. "I know. My setup isn't—" She stopped. "I'd like to build you a proper kitchen," he said. The words fell into the room and sat there. She looked at him. "Caleb." "Not a charity," he said before she could finish. "A business arrangement. You supply the cookhouse. I provide the kitchen infrastructure. We settle on a rate that accounts for the investment." He kept his voice completely level. "That's a contract, not a gift." She was quiet for a long moment. "You've thought about this for a while," she said. "Since the second week." "That's before—" She stopped again. "Before Whitmore. Before Thursday. Before any of this became urgent." "Yes," he said simply. She stared at him. "Why?" He looked back at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something shift in that clear, steady face. Not the practiced calm of a man who managed things, but something underneath it. Something less managed, something real. "Because you're sitting in a hole in the ground making remarkable things," he said quietly. "And nobody has given you a single reason to believe that's going to change. And it should change, and I can do something about that." He paused. "So I'm doing it." The cookhouse was quiet. Somewhere outside, 2 of the hands were arguing about something at a comfortable distance. She should say no. Every principle she'd built herself on in 14 months. The ones about needing nothing, expecting nothing. The ones that had kept her functional, when nothing else had said to say no. Thank him, ride home, find another way. She knew what the other way looked like. She'd been living it. She looked at this man standing in the doorway of his own cookhouse, who had carried gravel to her north wall and a chair leg in his saddlebag, and who ate her bread like it was worth eating, and called it craftsmanship without blinking. And she thought with a terrible specific clarity that she was already in trouble. Not because he was dangerous, because he wasn't. Because he was exactly what he appeared to be. And that was the most dangerous thing she'd encountered in a very long time. "I want to see the plans before anything gets built," she said. He didn't smile, but something in him she was learning to read it now released. "I'll have them drawn up by Thursday," he said, "and I want final say on the layout. It's your kitchen. And the rate. We'll negotiate it," he said. "Fair market. I'm holding you to that. I'd expect nothing less." She stood up from Cookie's chair, straightened her dress, and looked at him with the clearest look she could manage given everything her chest was doing that she was determined not to show. "This is a business arrangement," she said. "Yes?" he said. "Nothing more complicated than that." He held her gaze. Steady, unhurried. "Of course," he said. And she believed him. Or she almost believed him. Or she knew with the part of herself she'd been arguing with for 6 weeks that she didn't believe him at all, and that the thing she actually believed was considerably more frightening and considerably more real than any business arrangement either of them had the courage to name yet. She walked past him to the door. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he said behind her. Outside, Dell was waiting with the horses, talking to one of the other hands about something that made them both laugh. The ranch moved around her with its ordinary sounds and purposes, and she untied the sorrel and mounted and rode out of the yard with her back straight and her hands easy on the reins. She did not look back, but she knew without looking that he was still standing in the doorway. And she knew the way you know things that have already happened before. You've admitted they've happened, that the life she'd been building so carefully to need nothing and no one had just developed a fracture. Not the kind that brought things down. The kind that let the light in. She wasn't ready. She rode home anyway. And that night, for the first time in 14 months, she sat by the fire and let herself think past Saturday. Let herself think past the contract and the kitchen and the cookhouse and the careful, practical language they'd wrapped everything in. Let herself think about what it meant that Caleb Morgan had been planning this since the second week, that he had seen what she needed before she'd let herself say it, that he had come back every time. That was when she heard the hoofbeats. Not Caleb. It was full dark. He would never ride out this late without reason. These were coming fast, not from the Double M direction, but from town, and there were 2 sets, and something about the pace was wrong. She went to the door. 2 riders. She didn't recognize the first one in the dark. The second one she did. It was Henderson's boy, the teenager who swept the mercantile floor, riding hard and leaning forward like something was urgent. He pulled up at her post, breathing hard. "Miss Carter." He was trying to catch his breath. "Mr. Henderson sent me. He says you need to know. Whitmore was at the mercantile tonight. He knows about the Double M. He knows about Morgan." She went still. "He says to tell you," the boy said, "that he's already filed something with the county, some kind of lien, against the land your dugout sits on." The blood left her face, because she knew immediately, completely, with the cold clarity of someone who had survived enough to understand how these things worked, exactly what that meant. Whitmore wasn't coming after Henderson anymore. He was coming after her directly. And the land beneath her feet, the only thing between her and nothing, might not be hers to stand on come morning. She sent Henderson's boy home and stood in the dark for exactly 30 seconds. That was all she allowed herself. 30 seconds to feel the full weight of it, the cold, nauseating drop of understanding that someone had decided to take the last thing she had. 30 seconds to be afraid. 30 seconds to be furious. Then she went inside, lit the second lamp, and pulled the tin box from under the floorboard beneath the work table. Her father had kept records. That was one thing Frank Carter had done right, not because he was organized by nature, but because he'd spent enough of his life in debt that he'd learned the hard way that paper was the only thing that stood between a man and someone else's version of events. He'd kept every deed, every receipt, every letter that had anything to do with land or money or obligation, folded and flattened and stored in a tin box that he'd told Lydia about 2 weeks before he died, in the careful way a man speaks when he knows he's running out of time to say things. "Don't let anybody tell you what you own without showing you the paper first," he'd said. "And don't trust their paper without reading it yourself." She hadn't looked in the box since the bank had come for the house. It had been too painful going through it, too much of Frank's handwriting, too many documents that mapped the slow erosion of everything he'd tried to build. She opened it now. The land the dugout sat on was a separate parcel. She'd known that in a general way, but had never looked at the specific documentation because it hadn't seemed to matter. The land wasn't farmable, wasn't worth much, was just the 12-by-9 patch of earth she'd claimed because it was already there and the bank hadn't bothered with it. But she'd assumed it was hers because no one had told her it wasn't. Assuming she now understood was exactly what Whitmore had been counting on. She went through every document in the box. Twice. Her hands were steady. Her mind was moving the way it moved when she was baking. Not fast exactly, but precise. Each thing in order, nothing skipped. The original homestead claim. The survey document from 1871. The transfer when Frank bought the main parcel from the Ellison family. A letter from the land office. A receipt for the registration fee. And then at the bottom, folded smaller than the rest, a document she almost missed because it was tucked inside another, an envelope she'd assumed was empty. She unfolded it slowly. It was a secondary deed. A separate registration for the dugout parcel filed in 1873, 2 years after the main homestead claim, registered under her mother's name. Eleanor Carter, her mother who had died when Lydia was 9, whose name she had not seen written in years. She stared at the document. Her mother had registered this land separately, filed it under her own name, not Frank's. Which meant when the bank had come for Frank's debts, they had taken Frank's property, the house, the main parcel, the barn, but they had no legal claim to Eleanor Carter's parcel. And Eleanor Carter had no debts, because Eleanor Carter had been dead for 15 years, which meant the land passed to Eleanor's heir, which was Lydia. She sat back on her heels on the packed earth floor and held the document with both hands, and understood fully completely with the cold clarity of a woman who had just found a weapon she hadn't known she was carrying, that Daniel Whitmore's lien was fraudulent. He had filed against land. He had no legitimate claim to banking on the fact that she didn't know she had documentation to counter it, banking on the fact that a woman alone with no money and no connections would not be able to fight it, banking on the fact that she would simply leave. He had miscalculated one thing. He had not counted on the tin box. She folded the document carefully, put it in her dress pocket close against her side. Then she put everything else back in the box, put the box back under the floorboard, and stood up. It was past 9 o'clock at night. Caleb's ranch was 40 minutes by horse in daylight. In the dark on the east road with the bad crossing, it was longer. She went anyway. Dell answered the bunkhouse door when she rode into the yard, looking startled and immediately alert, the way young men do when they're trained to pay attention. "Miss Carter is everything. I need to speak to Caleb," she said. "Now." He didn't ask questions. He pointed to the main house and was already moving toward it before she'd finished tying the sorrel. Caleb came to the door in his work clothes, which meant he hadn't been to bed yet, which she registered with the part of her mind that was still tracking ordinary things, even while the rest of it was running the problem. He took one look at her face. "Come inside," he said. She came inside. She'd never been in the main house. They'd always been in the cookhouse, the yard her dugout. The house was plain and functional, same as everything about the Double M, and she registered none of it because the moment the door closed behind her, she turned and held out the document. "Read this," she said. He took it. He read it the way she'd hoped he would, thoroughly, without rushing, without performing comprehension for her benefit. She watched his face while he read and saw the moment he understood what he was holding, because something shifted behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, but the specific focus of a man who has just identified the fulcrum of a problem. He looked up. "Your mother registered this separately," he said, "in 1873. Which means the bank takeover. Didn't touch it. They took Frank's property. This wasn't Frank's property." He looked at the document again. "Whitmore filed a lien against a parcel he has no legal claim to." "Yes." "He's betting you don't know that." "Yes." Caleb set the document on the table with a deliberateness that was more controlled than anything he'd shown her yet. She recognized it for what it was, a man keeping his anger extremely specific. "He's been doing this," Caleb said, "in this county, for years, filing liens on land where the ownership is complicated or disputed, waiting for people to fold or leave, then buying the property at distressed rates." He looked at her. "He did it to the Pearson family 3 years ago, did it to a widow in the Elk Creek area. She left. Property sold at a quarter value." Lydia's jaw tightened. "He thought I'd leave too." "Yes, because I'm alone, because I have no money, because he thought I had no documentation." "Yes." He paused. "He was wrong. He was wrong," she agreed. They looked at each other across the plain wooden table in his plain functional house, and Lydia felt something she recognized from the deepest part of her practical self, the feeling of having a tool that fits exactly the problem in front of you. "I need a lawyer," she said. "I know one. Silas Rourke over in Caldwell. He's handled land cases before county court. Honest man, which is rarer than it should be. I can't afford. He owes me a favor." Caleb held her gaze. "Not you, me. He owes me, and I'm spending it on this. That's not charity. That's me using a resource I have." She wanted to argue. She looked at the document in his hand, her mother's careful signature at the bottom. E. Carter in the small, precise handwriting of a woman who had known something was worth protecting, and she thought about Eleanor Carter filing that document quietly separately, under her own name, 23 years ago. Not telling Frank, not making a production of it, just doing the thing that needed doing, leaving a trail her daughter might need someday. She thought about paying attention, about how it mattered. Call in the favor, she said. Something in Caleb's face was very still and very certain. I'll ride to Caldwell tomorrow morning, he said. I'd like you to come. Rourke needs to hear it from you and see the document. All right. We'll leave at first light. She nodded, started to turn toward the door. Lydia. She stopped. She turned back. He was standing at the table, the document still in his hand, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the practical assessment he gave. Problems, not the steady, unhurried attention he gave her in ordinary moments. Something older than that. Something that had been there for a while, underneath the fixing and the coffee and the chair legs and the gravel, and was just now too present to stay underneath. You rode out here alone in the dark, he said, on the East Road. I know the road. The crossing. I managed it. He was quiet for a moment. I know you did. Another pause. You always manage. Something in his voice had changed quieter with a weight behind it that hadn't been there a minute ago. But you didn't have to come alone. She looked at him. I didn't know if you'd still be awake, she said. I would always be awake for this, he said. I want you to know that. The house was very quiet. Outside somewhere, one of the horses shifted in the stable and went still. She told herself to say something practical, something that kept this in the territory where she knew how to move. I'll be here at first light, she said. I'll have horses ready. She left. She rode home in the dark on the East Road with the document pressed against her side in her pocket, and she thought about what he'd said. I would always be awake for this. And she thought about the way he'd looked when he said it, and she told herself firmly and repeatedly that tomorrow was about the lien. It was about the lien, nothing else. Silas Rourke was a small man with reading glasses. He kept pushing up his nose in the particular manner of a lawyer who had spent a long time dealing with cases that made him angry, a contained professional anger that he channeled entirely into his work and expressed only through the precision of his language. He looked at the document for 4 minutes straight without saying anything. Then he looked at Caleb. Then he looked at Lydia. Miss Carter, he said. Do you understand what you have here? A secondary deed filed under my mother's name, she said. More than that. He set the document down very carefully. This is a clean title, unencumbered. The primary homestead debt and the bank seizure have no bearing on this parcel whatsoever. Eleanor Carter owned this land free and clear, and upon her death it passed to her only heir. He looked at Lydia over the glasses. That's you. Yes. Whitmore's lien is not only fraudulent, it's provably fraudulent, Rourke said. He either didn't research the title thoroughly, which is negligent, or he did research it and filed anyway, which is criminal. He paused. In my experience with Daniel Whitmore, I'd guess the latter. Caleb said from the chair beside Lydia, Can we counterfile? We can do considerably more than counterfile. Rourke pulled out paper and a pen. We file a fraudulent lien claim with the county court, request immediate relief, and simultaneously file a complaint with the state land office. If Whitmore has done this before, and I suspect he has other cases may be relevant to the pattern. The Pearson family, Caleb said, 3 years ago, and a widow in Elk Creek. Rourke looked at him sharply. You know about Elk Creek. I know the broad shape of it. The widow's name was Hargreave. She left before anyone filed anything. He wrote the name down. If I can reach her. He stopped, started writing faster. This changes the scope of what we're dealing with. Lydia watched the pen move across the page and felt something she hadn't expected to feel in a county courthouse office, a specific, rising certainty. Not hope, which was too fragile. Something more structural than hope. Something that felt like the ground solidifying under her feet. How long? She asked. Emergency relief if the judge agrees to see it 2 weeks. Full resolution 2 months. Rourke looked at her. In the meantime, you stay on that land. Do not leave voluntarily. Do not let anyone tell you the lien gives them authority to remove you. It doesn't, not until a court rules, and no court is going to rule in favor of a fraudulent filing once I put this document in front of them. She nodded. Miss Carter. Rourke set down the pen. Your mother was a thorough woman. She was, Lydia said. Something tightened in her throat. She didn't let it go anywhere. She saved this for you, he said, not unkindly, just as a fact. I think, Lydia said carefully. She saved it for exactly this. They rode back from Caldwell with the afternoon light behind them and the meeting with Rourke still settling into its real shape. Caleb was quiet, in the way he was quiet when he was thinking something through, and Lydia was quiet because she was doing the same, and the comfortable familiarity of being quiet together, which she noticed only because it was so different from the loaded silences of their early weeks, was its own kind of information. About 5 miles from the Double M turnoff, he said, "How are you doing?" She thought about it honestly. "Steadier than I expected." "You handled Rourke well. Better than most people. He can be abrupt." "I've dealt with abrupt men before." "Not like you deal with them," he said. "Most people get rattled when someone talks fast and expects them to keep up. You just kept up." She glanced at him. "Was that a compliment?" "It was an observation." "You make a lot of those." "I do." He kept his eyes on the road. "I've had a lot to observe." They rode for another minute in silence. "Caleb." She said his name the way she'd learned to say it, not as a question or a preparation for an argument, just as itself. A way of reaching. He looked at her. "Why did you go to Caldwell with me?" she asked. "You could have given me Rourke's name and directions. You didn't have to come." He looked at her for a long moment. They were riding slowly enough that it was easy, the horses side by side, the road wide here, no reason to drop back into single file. "Because I didn't want you to walk into that alone," he said. "I could have." "I know you could have." He paused. "I didn't want you to have to." There it was again. The same thing he'd said in the dark in his house the night before, the same shape of it, not about what she was capable of, but about what she should have to manage alone. A distinction she had never had anyone make for her before. She looked forward at the road. "I've been alone for a long time," she said. It came out quieter than she meant it to. "I know. I got used to it." "I know that too. I built everything around it," she said. "Every decision, every plan, the whole structure of how I live, it's built on not needing." He was quiet. "And now," she stopped. "And now," he said. She didn't know how to finish it. She knew what was at the end of the sentence, the honest end, the one she'd been avoiding for weeks, but saying it meant stepping off the edge of the only ground she'd been standing on, and the ground after it was unknown, and she was a woman who had learned the catastrophic cost of trusting what she couldn't see. "It's harder than it used to be," she said finally. "Not needing." He pulled his horse to a stop. She stopped hers 2.5 steps ahead, turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that expression she'd seen in the house last night, the one that had been underneath everything else for weeks, that was now simply too present to keep underneath. "Lydia," he said, "don't." She said it quickly, not harshly, just quickly, because she needed to say it before whatever was coming changed the shape of things irrevocably. He waited. "Not today," she said. "Today is too much already. The document, Rourke, all of it." She met his eyes. "Not today." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Just that." No argument. No disappointment performed for her benefit. Just the same unhurried steadiness. He gave everything turned now toward the fact of her asking him to wait. She turned her horse back toward the road. "Thank you," she said, "for today." "You did the work," he said. "You kept the box. You found the document. You rode out in the dark. You came with me." "Yes," he said simply. "I did." They rode the rest of the way without talking, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, and it was not the silence of two people avoiding each other. It was the silence of two people who had said enough for one day, and both knew it. She turned off at the path to her dugout, and he rode with her to the edge of it, not all the way down, just to the fork, the way you walk someone to a corner and wait until they've turned it. "Stay on the land," he said. Rourke said the same. "I know. I'm saying it too." He looked at her steadily. Don't let anyone move you off it. That's your land. I know it is. Your mother made sure of it. She felt the thing tighten in her throat again. Stronger this time. Good night, Caleb, she said. Good night, Lydia. She rode down the path to the dugout, tied the sorrel, and went inside. The fire was banked low from the morning. She built it back up, not because she was cold, but because she needed something to do with her hands, while everything from the last 24 hours sorted itself into the right order. The document was on the table in front of her. Her mother's handwriting. E. Carter. The date. The parcel description in the measured language of official documents. She traced the signature once with her fingertip. Eleanor Carter had stood on this land and known something was worth protecting and had protected it in the only way available to her, quietly, carefully, without announcement, trusting that the paper would outlast whatever came after. Lydia understood that completely. She also understood sitting in the firelight with the document in front of her and the sound of Caleb's horse still fading on the road that she had been doing exactly the same thing. Protecting what mattered by keeping it contained, keeping it small, keeping it safe by never letting it grow large enough to lose. And she thought about what that had cost her. She thought about the 14 months and the invisible Tuesdays and the 4 minutes in Henderson's store and the careful, complete self-sufficiency she'd built like a wall around herself. It had kept her standing. It had also kept her alone. She put the document back in her pocket. Outside, the dark was full and ordinary. She thought about what Caleb hadn't said today, what she'd stopped him from saying, what he'd accepted being stopped from saying without protest. He'd waited. He would keep waiting. She understood that about him now, with the same certainty she understood the East Road and the dugout ceiling, and the way good bread should sound when you knock the bottom hollow fully baked. Nothing raw left in the center. She was not ready, but she was running out of reasons why. And somewhere in the specific terrifying space between not ready and running out of reasons, something was changing. She could feel it. The same way you feel a season turning. Not all at once. Not with drama. Just the unmistakable evidence in everything around you that what was is giving way to what comes next. She didn't sleep for a long time, but when she did not dream of losing ground. For the first time in a very long time, she dreamed of building something. The letter from the county court arrived on a Wednesday, delivered by the same boy who'd ridden out in the dark 3 weeks earlier with Henderson's warning. This time he was smiling when he handed it over. Lydia read it standing in the doorway of the dugout, the morning still cool, the paper steady in her hands, even though something in her chest was not. Rourke had filed the emergency relief petition 11 days ago. The judge had reviewed it in 4. The fraudulent lien had been suspended pending full hearing. Whitmore had been formally notified. A court date was set for 6 weeks out. At the bottom, in Rourke's small, precise handwriting, a note: Miss Carter, the Hargreave widow, has agreed to testify. We have a pattern now. Come see me when you can. This is going to hold. She folded the letter. She pressed it flat against her palm for 1 moment. Then she went inside and put it in the tin box next to her mother's deed. And she stood over that box for a long time without moving, thinking about Eleanor Carter, thinking about the document filed quietly and separately, 23 years ago, thinking about the kind of love that doesn't announce itself but simply prepares, leaves what's needed, trusts the person coming after to find it. She closed the box. She had work to do. Bambaik. Caleb came at mid-morning, not his usual Thursday time. And when she saw him ride up, she knew he'd already heard. Word moved fast in a county this size, especially word about Daniel Whitmore, especially now that people were beginning to understand that the shape of what he'd been doing was larger than any single family's misfortune. He dismounted, and she handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it, looked up. Rourke moves fast when he's motivated, he said. The Hargreave woman agreed to testify. I know. He sent word to me yesterday. He folded the letter and handed it back. How are you? She took the letter, looked at him. I feel like the ground stopped moving, she said. He nodded, slow and certain, like that was exactly right. Good. I also feel like I've been holding my breath for 3 weeks and just remembered how to stop. Also good. She turned back to the dugout door. Come in. There's coffee. There's always coffee, he said, following her. You've never complained. I never will. She poured the coffee, and they sat him in his chair, her at the table, and the ordinary comfort of it hit her differently today. Not threateningly, the way it had in the early weeks when she'd been watching herself allow it with the wariness of someone expecting the ground to shift. Just as itself. As what it was. Two people who had been through something together, sitting with their coffee in the morning. Caleb, she said. I want to talk about the kitchen. He looked up. Not as a theoretical, she said. As a plan, with numbers, with a timeline. She wrapped both hands around her cup. I've been doing the figures. If I double production and supply the cookhouse directly, plus 4 families on the East Route that Dell mentioned to me last week, I could clear what I need in 18 months, maybe less. He was watching her with that clear, level attention. What do you need? He asked. Enough to buy the parcel outright from my mother's estate title, she said. Which isn't much because it wasn't valued highly. And enough to build proper, not grand, not more than I can maintain but proper. A stove that works the way a stove should. A table with the right height. Storage. That's manageable, he said. I know it is. I've run the numbers 3 times. She met his eyes. I'm not asking you to fund it. I'm asking you to honor the contract we agreed to and let me fund it myself through the supply arrangement. That was always the plan. I know. I just needed to say it out loud to myself as much as to you. He drank his coffee. Something in his expression was careful in a way she recognized the look of a man who had more to say and was deciding how much of it to say right now. What? She asked. The plans are drawn, he said. For the kitchen. I had them done 2 weeks ago. She stared at him. You drew plans before we'd settled anything. I draw plans when I see a problem I intend to solve. He set down the cup. If you'd told me to stop, I'd have stopped. You didn't tell me to stop. I told you to wait. You told me not today. There's a difference. She opened her mouth, closed it. There's always a difference with you, she said. Generally, yes. He stood up. I have them in the saddlebag. Can I show you? She looked at him for a long moment. Get the plans, she said. He came back with a rolled piece of drafting paper, spread it on the table between them, held the corners down with his coffee cup and her flour tin. She leaned over it, and he stood beside her, close enough that she could hear him breathe. And he walked her through it, the footprint, the stove position, the table height he'd noted from watching her work the storage along the east wall, the window on the north side for morning light without heat. She was quiet through all of it. Looking. Reading the lines the way she read everything thoroughly practically. Looking for what was wrong, looking for what could fail. There was very little wrong. The window was in exactly the right place. How did you know? She said. Know what? She pointed to the window. The morning light. I always turn toward north in the morning when I'm working. You noticed that. I told you, he said. I notice things. She straightened up. He was standing directly beside her, closer than he usually stood, because the table was small, and the plans needed 2 pairs of eyes. And when she straightened, they were closer than they'd ever been in the ordinary course of things, and neither of them stepped back. She looked at him. He looked at her. I want to say something, he said. And I'd like you to let me say all of it before you tell me not today. Her heart was doing something specific and inconvenient. All right, she said. He was quiet for just a moment, not hesitating. She understood now, but making sure he was going to say it right. The way he did everything. With care. With attention. I came down your path 8 weeks ago because I bought a loaf of bread and couldn't stop thinking about who made it, he said. I told you that the first day. I came back because the woman I found when I got here was... He stopped. Started again. You were managing. You were doing everything right and doing it alone, and the town had made itself comfortable with the fact of you struggling, and you had made yourself comfortable with it too. or you'd made yourself stop expecting anything different, which isn't the same thing. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that she heard clearly. And I kept coming back because every time I left, I thought about what you'd said, or what you'd done, and I wanted to know more of it. I wanted to know more of you. And somewhere around the third week, I stopped pretending that was about the bread. She didn't move. I'm not asking you to feel something you don't feel, he said. I'm not asking you to change the arrangement we have if the arrangement is working for you. But I'm done not saying it, because not saying it is a kind of dishonesty, and I don't have it in me to be dishonest with you. He looked at her directly with the same unguarded steadiness he'd given her from the very beginning. I want to build you that kitchen. I want to buy the East Road families and listen to you talk about bread starter with cookie. I want to sit in that chair every Thursday morning and every Saturday, and some days that aren't Thursday or Saturday. I want... He stopped. I want to be the person you ride to in the dark when something goes wrong. She realized she hadn't taken a full breath in a while. You already are, she said quietly. Something moved across his face. I know, he said. I just needed you to say it. She looked at the plans on the table, the window in exactly the right place, the table at exactly the right height. The evidence of someone paying the kind of attention that doesn't get paid by accident, that gets paid because the person doing it has decided at some point, and for their own reasons, that you are worth the precision. She looked back at him. I built everything around not needing, she said. You know that. I know. It's going to take me time to... She searched for the word. I know that too. He didn't rush her. He never rushed her. I'm not going anywhere, Lydia. And the thing that broke her open finally completely was not the words themselves, but the absolute absence of performance in them. No drama, no grand gesture. Just a man telling her the plain truth about what he intended in the same voice he used to tell her a roof needed bracing or a chair leg needed fixing. I'm not going anywhere. As simple as that. As solid as that. She reached out and put her hand over his on the edge of the plan. Just her hand over his, both of them still standing at the table, and she felt him go completely still for a single moment before his hand turned under hers and held it. Neither of them said anything. The fire did its quiet work. Outside, the ordinary sounds of a morning on the prairie moved around the dugout, indifferent and continuous, the same as they always were. Inside, something had shifted that both of them knew would not shift back. The county court hearing was 6 weeks later on a Thursday in late September, when the air had started to carry the first suggestion of fall. Lydia wore her good dress, the dark brown one she kept for occasions, and her hair pinned up the way her mother had taught her, and she rode into Grover beside Caleb, with her back straight, and the tin box of documents in the saddlebag, and Silas Rourke waiting for them at the courthouse steps, looking like a man who had spent the past 6 weeks building something that was not going to fall. She had never been inside the county courthouse before. She walked in like she had every right to be there. Because she did. Daniel Whitmore was already seated when they entered the courtroom, a heavy man in an expensive coat, who had spent so long being the largest financial presence in the room that he'd forgotten how to sit, like he might lose. He glanced at Lydia when she came in. His expression did not change. He looked at Caleb behind her, and something shifted slightly in his eyes, but he looked away before it became anything legible. His lawyer was a man named Frost, from the city brought in specifically for this, which told Lydia everything she needed to know about how seriously Whitmore was taking the counterfiling. Good. She wanted him to take it seriously. Rourke laid out the case in the methodical, precise way he did everything: the deed, the secondary registration, the clear title under Eleanor Carter's name, the bank seizure records that explicitly did not include the parcel, the fraudulent lien filing with its specific inaccuracies. Then he presented the Hargreave case. Then 2 other cases Rourke had found in the 6 weeks since a family named Ortega, whose parcel had been absorbed into Whitmore Holdings 3 years ago under suspicious circumstances, and a man named Briggs who'd left the county without realizing what he'd signed away. Frost objected to this pattern evidence. The judge overruled him twice. The judge was a man named Calloway, who had the particular face of someone who did not enjoy having his court used as a mechanism for fraud, and was not making any effort to hide that fact. Whitmore's lawyer argued that the Carter filing was improperly registered, that Eleanor Carter's legal standing was unclear, that the secondary deed had procedural defects. Rourke had answers to all of its specific documented answers, that he had clearly prepared for each possible objection, because he was a man who did not walk into rooms unprepared. The hearing lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, Judge Calloway removed his glasses, set them on the bench, and looked at the room for a moment before he spoke. "The lien filed by Daniel Whitmore against the Carter parcel is hereby dissolved," he said. "The title is confirmed as belonging to Lydia Carter, heir of Eleanor Carter, free and clear of any claim by the defendant." He looked at Whitmore's table. "I am also referring Mr. Whitmore's filing practices to the State Land Office for review in connection with the cases presented here today. This court takes a dim view of individuals who use the filing system as a tool of coercion against landowners who lack the resources to defend themselves." He replaced his glasses. "We're done here. Rourke turned to Lydia immediately, said nothing, just gave her a single nod that meant it's done. She nodded back. She kept her face composed for exactly the time it took to walk out of the courthouse and down the front steps and around the corner of the building to the narrow alley where Caleb had walked beside her, and where, when they stopped, she put both hands over her mouth and breathed. He stood in front of her and didn't say anything. Just was there. Close enough that she could have reached for him, steady enough that she could feel the steadiness of him without touching. She breathed. She dropped her hands. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he confirmed. "The land is mine." "The land was always yours," he said. The court just said it out loud. She looked at him. Something in her chest was enormous and tight and loosening, at the same time, the way things feel when you've been holding on for so long that letting go is almost painful. "My mother knew," she said. "Yes. She knew someone might try. She filed it separately so it would be safe." She paused. "She never told my father. She just did it quietly. Made sure." "She was looking out for you," Caleb said. "The only way she could." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "She died when I was 9. I didn't think she'd gotten to do much of that." "She did more than you knew," he said simply. She thought about Eleanor Carter walking into a land office 23 years ago, filing a document under her own name, paying the fee, folding the paper and putting it somewhere safe, not telling Frank, not announcing it, just doing the thing that needed doing and trusting it would be found. She understood that woman completely. She understood her better today than she ever had. "Let's go home," she said. Caleb looked at her, at that word home plural, unspecific, used easily and without thinking, and he said nothing about it. But she saw his face, and she knew he'd heard it. She had meant it exactly the way it sounded. The kitchen went up in October, not the grand construction of a man spending money to impress the steady, purposeful work of people who knew what they were building and why. Caleb brought 3 of the double M hands, who had carpentry skill, and Dell, who had enthusiasm, if not always accuracy, and Cookie, who showed up on the second day, claiming he only wanted to supervise, and ended up doing more useful work than 2 of the others combined. Lydia was there every day. She didn't stand back and watch. She made decisions: this beam here, that shelf at that height, the stove positioned so the flue drew clean, and the work surface caught the morning light from the north window. When something was wrong, she said so directly, and the men adjusted without drama, because Caleb had made clear from the first morning that this was her kitchen, and her judgment on its construction was final. That was the week she understood fully in her body, and not just her mind, what it meant to have someone stand behind your authority without you having to ask. She'd never had that before. She hadn't known how much weight she'd been carrying by not having it. By the end of the second week, the structure was up solid cedar and good pine tight enough for winter. By the end of the third week, the stove was set and the shelves were hung and the table was in place at exactly the right height. She stood in the middle of it on the last day of October and turned around slowly. Real walls, a real floor, a window where the morning came in clean and useful, a door with a proper hinge that swung without protest. Caleb came in behind her and stood at the door and watched her turn in the middle of the room. "Well," he said. She stopped turning, looked at him. "It's right," she said. "I know. The window is where it should be." She looked at him steadily. "You knew what I needed before I said it." "I paid attention," he said. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him, closer than the practical distance of two people discussing construction, and she looked up at him, and she said plainly, directly, in the same voice she used for everything that mattered, "I'm done being afraid of this." He looked down at her. His face was very still and very certain. "All right," he said. "I'm not going to keep calling it a business arrangement." "Good," he said, "because it stopped being one about 7 weeks ago." She put her hand against his chest, flat, deliberate, feeling the steady beat of him under her palm, and she felt him breathe. "I'm not easy," she said. "I've been alone long enough that I have habits that are going to be difficult. I have a few of those myself. I'm going to want final say on my own kitchen. You already have it, and I'm going to pay back every cent of Lydia." He put his hand over hers where it rested against his chest, the same way she'd covered his hand 8 weeks ago at the table, returned. "I know." She looked at him. He looked at her. And this time, when she didn't say "not today," he understood what that meant. He brought his other hand up to her face, careful, unhurried the way he did everything, and she let him, and the kiss he gave her was not a performance, and not a declaration, and not the resolution of a negotiation. It was just the thing that had been building since a man had held a loaf of bread in a mercantile and asked who made it, since a woman had looked up from her work table and told him to help himself to the coffee, since every Thursday morning, and every Saturday, and every day in between, when they'd been two people paying attention to each other until attention had become something neither of them knew how to stop. It was inevitable. It was also somehow exactly on time. The town of Grover noticed as small towns do. It noticed the new structure on the Carter parcel. It noticed Caleb Morgan's horse tied to the fence post on weekday mornings. It noticed Lydia Carter's bread appearing now not just on Henderson's shelf, but delivered directly twice a week to 6 families on the East Route, and the Double M Cookhouse sold under her name, labeled in her handwriting, not tucked anonymously into a back shelf, but present and known and unmistakably hers. Some of the town made its peace with this quickly. Some took longer. Mrs. Alderton stopped at the new kitchen door one November morning, ostensibly to ask about purchasing a loaf, and stood in the doorway long enough to see the setup. The real stove, the organized shelves, the evidence of a working enterprise, and left with 2 loaves and a quieter version of the assumptions she'd ridden in with. Reverend Aldous did not come by. Lydia did not expect him to, and did not miss it. Henderson came 3 weeks after the hearing with his hat in his hands and an expression that cost him something. "I should have done better by you," he said, when Whitmore came in. Before that even. She looked at him. "You were protecting your livelihood." "I know. Doesn't make it right." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "It doesn't. But I appreciate you saying so." She handed him a loaf, the good heel, the thick crust, and he took it with something in his face that she chose to accept as the beginning of something better than what had come before. Rourke sent word in December that the State Land Office had opened a formal review of Whitmore's filing practices across 3 counties. The Ortega family's case was being re-examined. Briggs had been located in Kansas and had agreed to provide testimony. Whitmore had very quietly begun liquidating some of his holdings. Lydia read Rourke's letter at the kitchen table in the morning light and felt something she recognized as justice, not the loud, satisfying kind from stories, but the real kind, which was slower and quieter and arrived looking like paperwork. Which was fine. Paperwork had saved her. She had considerable respect for paperwork. She wrote Rourke back, thanked him, and put the letter in the tin box next to her mother's deed. The box was getting full. She thought Eleanor Carter would have found that appropriate. Schultz. Caleb asked her to marry him on a Thursday morning in January, which was correct and entirely in character. He came in with the coffee already in his hand because she'd forgotten to start it. She'd been up since 4 working on a new batch and had lost track. And he set her cup in front of her and sat down in his chair and said without preamble, without kneeling or speech-making or any of the theater she would have found painful anyway. "I'd like you to marry me." She looked up from the dough. "Just like that," she said. "Did you want me to make it more complicated?" "No." "Then yes, just like that." He watched her. "You don't have to answer right now." She looked at him. This man who had come down her path 8 months ago with her bread in his hands, and had come back every time, and had fixed every broken thing, and had stood behind her in every room she'd walked into since, not in front of her, not pulling her along, but behind her, steady as the posts he'd braced her roof with. She thought about her mother filing a deed in her own name. She thought about what it meant to protect something by being precise about what it was. She thought about the 14 months alone, and the 8 months less alone, and the difference between them, which was not small and had not been small since approximately the 3rd week. She turned back to the dough, pressed her hands into it. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Don't make me say it twice, Caleb." She heard him breathe a long, slow exhale, the kind that comes from the release of something held carefully for a long time. And then he picked up his coffee and she worked the dough, and neither of them said anything else for a while. It was, she thought, exactly right. They married in March in the new kitchen with Dell and Cookie and Rourke and 6 families from the East Route and Henderson standing as witnesses, and the spring light coming through the north window at exactly the angle it was designed to catch. No church, no ceremony that required anyone's permission. Just 2 people who had decided, and a room full of people who had watched them get there. She kept the tin box. She kept her mother's deed filed separately. In her own name, Lydia Morgan recorded at the county land office on a Tuesday in March, paid for in full with her own money from 8 months of supplying bread to people who had learned finally where it came from. And if the clerk at the county office noted the name Carter in the original deed and looked up at her with a question in his eyes, she simply looked back at him with the calm, clear expression of a woman who had read every document on that desk and understood exactly what it said. Because her mother had taught her something that 14 months alone had reinforced, and 8 months with Caleb Morgan had proven beyond any remaining doubt. The ground beneath your feet is only as solid as what you know about it. Know your deed. Know your title. Know what belongs to you and what doesn't, and never let anyone else write the document that tells that story. Lydia Carter had known exactly what she owned. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to stand on it without apology. That moment had come, and she had not missed it, and she had not stepped back, and the ground had held. It had held because she had made sure it would. And now, standing in her own kitchen on a March morning with the light coming in right, and the bread already cooling on the shelf, and Caleb Morgan's hand in hers, she understood with complete and final certainty something her mother had known, and her father had not. The most powerful thing a woman can own is the paper that proves what's hers, and the absolute refusal to let anyone tell her it says something different than it does.